Hi there, it's Amy from Mindful Art Studio, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about how I approach mixing colors and some of the basic watercolor techniques that you'll need to get started. So let's dive right in. Let's approach color mixing in a really simple way. Now, it's great to start with kind of the starter set for whatever brand you're buying from, whether that's Winsor Newton or Daniel Smith. And then, you'll get kind of their general blue, red, yellow, usually a black, and then maybe a green of some sort, or maybe a violet of some sort. But you can also mix your own. If you have their kind of standard blue and red, you'll get a violet or a purple when you mix them. Same thing, if you mix a red and a yellow, you're going to get an orange. And if you mix their yellow and their blue, you're going to get a green. And of course, lots of things affect the tint and the tone and the shade and all of that, depending on how much water you have, depending on whether it's a warm or a cool color. But I think to start, it's a lot more fun to just take the colors you have and start playing with mixing them. So I love, and I've already sprayed this, I love yellow ochre. I use it a lot. You can see it here in this piece. And then I'm gonna rinse my brush. And then I also really love rose madder. Just creating a mix here. I have quite a bit of water here, too much in fact, so I'm just gonna come out into this open space. And this is dried paint just on the edge here, and I could stand to squeeze a bit more out probably. You can see how there's no paint wasted. And I use the edges like people use the well. Now I can just kind of take the tip, come in here, just grabbing water, grabbing pigment, just playing and creating a stronger mix here. Right, and now I can come over here and start to pull in some of my ochre color. Right, I have a little watercolor journal here and I can just kind of test. See what that's like. Let's add a bit more. More ochre, see what that's like. And you can see how pretty these colors are next to each other as well. Let's go even more ochre. And then we could also add more water. I do a lot of playing with combining two different colors and then just seeing what I can do with those two different colors, right? So now it's a lighter wash because it's got more water in it. And I find this process so much fun, and I really get to understand both colors and what they can do. And I can make a lot of really beautiful pieces just by using these, two, maybe three colors. So what would happen if we grabbed a little burnt umber? Now I didn't pre-spray that. Let me give that. Takes a minute for the water to kind of seep in and wake up the color. Just creating a mix here. Right, and I could come over here and offload a lot of what's on my brush. Take some of what I had here and come in together, and now see what that does. All right, we've taken it a little bit more to the brown direction. We could also experiment with grabbing a bit more of that madder rose and see where that takes us. It's not all that different from where we started, actually. So I might grab a bunch more. Now it's just sort of a warm brown. Not just. Right, but you can see how it's shifting. But look how harmonious and beautiful that just page of simple marks is. This is a great way to play. And we do this kind of thing in the Simplest Things Challenge, and it really creates a beautiful grid on your page. And you can layer over it, but it also allows you to have like a test page for whatever you're working on, right? I could come over here and just have the madder rose with just a hint of the burnt umber. And that's quite nice. Right, so that's how I work with mixing. If I wanted to mix a particular color, because I'm going for something more exact, like I'm trying to paint a bird or something like that, then obviously I'm gonna have to be a lot more choosy about which paint colors I'm using and thinking about how warm or cool they are. But for my purposes, I'm at the moment mostly working abstract and really just responding to what I like. So these are a lot of the colors that I personally like right now and I'm into right now. And I would just really encourage you, when you're doing more abstract work, just give yourself that permission. So let's look at some of the basics. So first of all, you notice I made 2 separate pools of color, right? And sometimes when people are new to watercolor, I see them mix it and it looks like acrylic. It really should be very, it depends on how concentrated you want it, but it shouldn't look creamy, right? It should be like this kind of consistency. Got like a little, oops, got a splooch there. Hang on a second. Right, and you can see you can get more or less concentrated. And then as you add more water, it gets more washy. Right, and you can get beautiful effects just with one color too. Right, so, so when you're mixing, you make the 2 separate puddles, and then you either pull one into the other or just make a third. But if you immediately try and mix both together in one spot, you're going to potentially waste a lot of paint when you don't get the right amount of, color A or color B, and you'll get really frustrated. So whatever paints I'm using, I always follow that principle. I just pull a little bit of this into here and wipe off, and then pull, right? Because we don't want to contaminate that color. Pull a little bit of this, right? And so you adjust bit by bit. That way we don't waste. So let's look at some of the basics. So a wash. So a wash is just creating like a little swath of color. So if we paint directly on the dry page, that's called wet on dry. Don't let those terms fool you. There's nothing complex about that. So I'm just gonna make a wash of color. Okay, that's a wash. Nothing more complicated than that. If we want to do wet on wet, then we're going to rinse off our brush, come into the clear water jar that we've reserved, and paint just clear water on the page. And the trick with wet on wet is that you want the surface of your paper looking like a freshly cut orange. So that means you've got to get your water level right. You don't want puddles, shouldn't be running around, but it should look like a wet, glistening orange. And you need to pre-mix your colors, because otherwise, if you now pause, mix all your colors, you don't have the right water level. So now come right into your pre-mixed color. And you can see how it's going to move and bloom for me. Right, and it'll do that with dots, with lines. Right, I could make it more of a solid block. I can tip it. I've got a little excess water down there that's pooling, so I can just use my brush, dry it off on my paper towel, and then it becomes like a sponge. And just come back to my towel and grab it. Right, you can see how this adds a lot more texture. Gonna get a little bit more of a concentrated mix here. Let's see how that spreads. Right, and if you come off into the dry, that's kind of interesting, it anchors. I always like playing with that. You can even come back into the wet paint. So that's wet on wet. Now dry brushing is just when you get a relatively dry brush. Okay, not totally dry, but relatively dry. And we're gonna grab some paint. Right, we're still grabbing a watercolor paint mixture. Then we're gonna dab off the brush. Right, you could dab it off in your palette too. And see, right, how we get this texture. So that's another way of adding texture. Right, we just have a dry brush. And then lifting. Lifting is where we go into a dry section with a damp, not sopping wet, damp brush. And use it to sort of erase. Now some colors will erase more easily than others. You can see it's called lifting, so I'm sort of lifting the color off the page. Right, some colors stain the paper more than others. And that just depends on color properties. You can look all that stuff up, or you can just experiment. But you can see I'm lifting that color up and off the page. That's great for creating highlights. That's great for fixing mistakes on edges and things. You can do that with your brush. You can do that with a sponge, with a paper towel. And then glazing. Glazing is where we take a separate color and go over another. So I think these are dry enough that I can also do that. So maybe I will take some of the turquoise. I did spray that earlier, so I think it'll be activated enough. And I'll just create a swath of color. Let's see. Right, and it kind of overlaps. Right, you can see two distinct layers. Right, and because the layer underneath is dry, it's not moving around. Not the most attractive color choice combo given the rest of the page, but you get the point. So I'll give you some examples here because I've been playing with glazing a ton. And this goes back to my initial point of pick a couple of colors, 2, maybe 3, and just play a lot. So Some of this series started with, this is a quinacridone orange, which I adore. And you can see I'm mixing it in with some of the burnt umber. There may be some of the ochre in there. I don't think so, I'm not sure. And for sure some of the madder rose, because I've been playing with the same color scheme here. So I started there and I did lots of those sheets. And then I started moving into doing some other shapes. And then those eventually turned into circles, right? And so that's glazing. Those layers where you can see the underlayers, this is part of the beauty of watercolor, right? But really, right, so this is all glazing. That's point number one. But point number two is how much I want you to really just play with the same thing over and over again. And this is how you're going to get to know your paints and what they do and what you're capable of and what your paints are capable of. And you start to make little variations and see where it wants to take you. And you just have such a good time and learn so much. Work small, right? Then it doesn't feel quite so precious. But all these little explorations. And then you might notice that some of them are a little bit bowed. That's because when I work on the small sheets, it really doesn't make sense to size or pre-soak and dry all of these tiny little experiments. It makes more sense to see what I like. And then when I get something I like, then I will just wet the back and press it so that it goes flat and I can keep it and frame it or whatever it might be. I also use them in my art journals, and it's just a whole lot of fun. There's so much you can do with these, and you can use some of the bleeding like we did here. You can see some real bleeds here, right? You can tip things. So even just with what I've given you right here, you've got a ton to play with, and I hope you have a really great time with it, and we'll see you soon. Bye.